And finally, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Joshua Ramus. Believing architecture should actively empower its users and communities, Joshua's work advances building paradigms and promotes the agency of architecture. Over his 28-year career, Joshua co-founded the firm OMA New York, which he later rebranded as Rex, and led the design of projects that have been celebrated worldwide, including the Seattle Central Library, the D. and Charles Wyly Theater in Dallas, and the A+ award-winning Perelman Performing Arts Center at the World Trade Center in New York, about which the New York Times declared Lower Manhattan could have hardly asked for a more spectacular work of public architecture. Joshua has been credited as one of the 5 greatest architects under 50 by HuffPost, one of the world's most influential young architects by Wallpaper magazine, and one of the 20 most influential players in design by Fast Company, among many other accolades. And with that, I'll hand over the mic to you, Joshua. What have you got in store for us today?
Great, thank you. Hey, so first, if I could give maybe a caveat to the presentation, and that's to say that we're going to be talking about performing arts centers, and the absolute most important thing in that typology is the interaction between performer and audience members. And just to point out the obvious, we have none of that here. So I'm going to be speaking to a dead screen where there's no give and take. And so I just say it's a very difficult format within to lecture. So I just ask for your forgiveness in advance. So I think I'm going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have questions after that. And I want to start by actually taking a step back and framing how we see performing arts centers within the larger scope of our work. And that's to say that for us, anything that we work on, the single most important thing is empowerment. And what I mean by that is the ability of the architecture beyond inspiring through form and beauty, the ability of the architecture to literally do things, to literally change how people work, play, live, and so forth. And across all typologies, that means that we've also started to realize that inherently that means we have to rethink flexibility in pretty much every one of those typologies. And I have to level of critique at the way we as architects are doing that. We're still operating, really for the last 100 years, using the high modernist notion of flexibility being a blank slate or a tabula rasa on which or in which you can do anything. And in the visual arts, that has played out as the white cube, and in the performing arts, the black box. Our critique of that is that we've seen over and over and over again that these kinds of tabula rasa, if that's a word, I don't know what the plural of tabula rasa is, that they demand an enormous amount of intellectual and economic capital in order to transform them. And so institutions don't have that capital, don't have that money, and so they kind of get straitjacketed by this, in theory, this highly flexible venue. Throughout all our work, what we're seeing is kind of a reinvention of flexibility and going in a very different direction, more like specificity. I'm going to give an example kind of as a metaphor, and then I'll come back to it later. And it's Noguchi's playscapes. Right? Noguchi wanted to create an environment that was already very similar to how a printmaker will scratch her or his zinc plate in order to create something with which you either work with or work against. This was his idea for playgrounds, that he would just create this environment of lots of different kind of objects and obstacles that children would then invent to play within. And that's more along the lines of the idea of flexibility I want to advance within these performing arts centers. And I would argue really with any other kind of typology. And so within the performing arts centers, we've labeled this new way of thinking, we call it presets. And so let me give a kind of a restate what I just did visually. So if this arrow suggests the full breadth of, in theory, anything you could do in a black box, what inevitably happens is because of limited money and staff, is an institution will build one thing into that, theoretically fully flexible environment, and then they sort of push it off center. They figure out ways to deviate from that thing they built in. And so this is what I mean by the promise of the blank slate really leads to actually quite limited flexibility. And presets is an idea that what if we were to provide a series of high-performing, very different presets, each, in the case of Performing Arts Center, each one that has excellent acoustics, intimacy, and sightlines. We know how much time and how much money and how much staff it would take us to move amongst these presets. And we have a belief that the institutions, the creative power, will also, just as I said before, start to figure out ways to push these off center, to kind of make deviations within them. And you can see that, weirdly, this idea of presets starts to cover the full spectrum of possibility, of potential. And that's what I want to put forth really as the underlying theme of the presentation of the three projects. So I'm going to talk about our three main performing arts centers. I'm going to talk about them in sequence and talk about the things we learned from one that we carried into the next and so forth. So I have to start with the Dean Charles Wyly Theater in Dallas. It's important to give context about this building and its company. The Dallas Theater Center, had built up over a course of about 50 years prior to our starting the project, built up renown for being a very innovative, sometimes experimental theater company, something that really was an outlier, right? You normally expect that kind of innovation to be in places like New York and Chicago and Seattle and Los Angeles. Dallas shouldn't have really been on the map, but this company was. And we believe that was in large part to the fact that they had been performing in this very, very, what's the right word? It was a dilapidated shed, for lack of a better way of describing it. So it wasn't sexy, but it provided the artistic director and the artist basically to do the ability to do whatever they wanted, right? They could dig a hole through the floor, a 30-foot hole through the floor if they're doing a cherry orchard, and they could make a well. They did a streetcar named Desire. They just blew a hole through the side of the building, and so that a motorcycle could drive directly in and through the stage. And so weirdly, the fact that they were in this very compromised building allowed them to become innovative. And our fear was that when we would give them a brand new building, that new building, that new pristine building, would curb the ability to kind of change their environment, right? And that was terrifying to us, that we could become the reason why this really important company actually lost its the thing that made it unique. And our proposal at first might seem odd, but our proposal was to take the front of house and back of house and put them front of house below house and back of house above house. And throughout the course of having described the project, I'll describe the three advantages of doing that. And the most important was it created what we like to call superfly, right? It turned the whole building into a massive fly tower. It took all of the freedoms you normally expect with the stage, and it smeared them out over the entire auditorium. Anything within that environment that was more pristine could be lifted, raised, or moved, and anything else was rough and could be drilled, cut, nailed, glued, and reassembled at limited cost. And it also, as I'll describe in a moment, also allowed the stage to bleed out into the environment and the environment to bleed into the building. And so this is the building from another side. You see literally how, we as I said, we called it Superfly. We also have called it a theater machine. So these are the four, quote, presets that we were working on, that we had to know that we could move between them quickly with a limited amount of stage-hands and known time, proscenium, thrust, flat floor, and studio theater. But we were also working in, idle hands of the devil. We were working in the background trying to figure out what ways could they actually already take those tools and deviate them. And we created things like Arena and Traverse, which are well known, but then we also invented our own bipolar and sandwich, just to see how far we could push this set of infrastructure that we were developing. And I'm going to show a video of it transforming, and I'm going to say something over the top of it, which is in the first 4 years of operation, they did 28 shows in 25 different configurations. And remember, we gave them 4 presets, and that means that the power of this approach, the idea of presets engendering incredible flexibility is that if we gave them 4 and they did 28 and 25 different configurations, that means they had to have invented at least 21, right? And so this project actually verified our idea about flexibility, about this idea of specificity and presets actually engendering more flexibility than a blank slate. So here you see the auditorium. I'm just going to, so this is end stage, this is thrust, this is, I don't know, they created movable seating wagons that they rolled all around the space to do the whiz. This is Henry IV in God knows what configuration. You can see that basically the stage and the seating were completely intertwined. And it's an important theme that I have to state, which is all of this mechanization is dumb. So here you see the massive proscenium. It was probably about 28 tons that we had to move out of the space. And we always tell our clients when working on these theater projects, do not beta test, do not come up with new technology. Figure out ways of using known technology in novel ways. So the way we were moving the balconies and the way we moved the massive proscenium is actually through a scoreboard lift. And why a scoreboard lift? Because right down the street is the American Airlines Arena. There are scoreboards there. If they can't move the scoreboard between when there's a Dallas Mavericks game and they have the ice capades, you can imagine how much money they're going to lose. And so this is a piece of technology that is tried and true, it's warranted. And there's also someone that's over there that can fix that one, who can also come immediately over here and support any kind of repair on this one. Similarly, the way we are moving, reconfiguring the floor, the seating, is we took technology that's more associated with the stage side of opera houses and we applied it to the seating side. And so this is a theme that I'm going to come back to throughout today's presentation. We like to call it dare to be dumb. So the second advantage of the stacked theater design was that it actually allowed the artistic directors to control suspension of disbelief, right? If they want to allow Dallas into a performance, they can do so in the last act. Like if in Macbeth, you want to have the parable of Macbeth applied to everyone's daily life, you could lift the curtains and they could see Dallas, but without hearing it. It also had a huge kind of unanticipated advantage, is that it allowed the public to see the creation of art. Right? It allowed the public to see the building of scenography, the blocking of scenes if the artist allowed it to happen, and so forth. And on this lawn, it has become standard that people will come not to watch a performance, but they'll come to have dinner, and they'll set up a picnic and they'll watch the creation of the art. And that's led to a massive increase in the patronage. So just to give you a further sense of how open the auditorium could actually be to the exterior and vice versa, this is actually a performance that was designed for the theater called Colossal, and it's about Texas football. As the building's in Texas, football is very important. And you can see how they did the entire performance literally with Dallas as the backdrop. We took it a step further, again, going back to the original sort of dilapidated shed, is that also that perimeter, not only can you allow it to be seen from the exterior in, but you can actually also allow the public to bypass the lobby and have a direct sequence from the exterior into the building, into the performance chamber. And I'll come back to this because the building is what we call multi-form, but this started to introduce an idea about multi-procession, ideas in which an artistic director could script different ways that the public could sequence into a performance. And then the last advantage of the stack design is that it actually gave us the opportunity for the entire company, not just the artists to mingle, but also the back of house support, the managerial support, office functions, and so forth. They all start to become blended in that upper stack, right? So this is a kind of a lobby space that can also be extended into the black box. This is the black box. You can see on the left that there is what looks like the control booth. It is the control booth, but it is also a meeting space. for the offices. You see the offices above that look down into the meeting space, that those offices then look into the costume shop. Costume shop has a conference room that looks into the breakout space, the exterior terrace of the main rehearsal space, then the main rehearsal space, which then looks out onto the terrace, and the terrace that looks out over Dallas. So just to give this idea that there's this constant sequence of these spaces that allow for the company to create cohesion, that the art isn't segregated in one space and the advertising and fundraising is placed in another, but it created this kind of universal cohesion. Okay, so that's the Dallas Theater. I'm going to segue now into the Perelman Performing Arts Center. I think you probably know its site. It's on the right there. We are feet away from the memorial, from the 9/11 memorial. Again, I want to give the background of the project. Obviously, so this was the last building in the master plan. It was the only cultural component of the master plan. It was conceived with the idea that the restorative power of art could create a sense of optimism on the site. And as such, the mission of the building is to produce or to co-produce original work. And that's very important. That makes it a rather distinct kind of institution and therefore a distinct kind of building. It means that the work that is there is always in the formation, right? It's very early on, it's getting workshopped. The artistic director, the artists are constantly trying to rethink how the work will be presented. And therefore it was important to create a building that was wildly flexible, that didn't have the trappings that I mentioned before of a flexible building requiring a huge amount of economic cost in order to transform, but such that the building could react to the art and not that the art had to react to the building. And I'll give a little bit of just the overarching design. Given its context, we wanted to create a very pure, elegant building. It is basically a cube that recognizes the sobriety of its context. But when the memorial goes to sleep in the evenings and this building, quote, turns on, we actually have it literally turn on, right? It begins to assert itself, it dematerializes and glows, and has a kind of respectful independence from the rest of the context during the period that there are performances. And that's done by laminating 12 millimeter thick pieces of marble from Estremoz, Portugal, that have a lot of iron in them, and that's why the building glows this amber color. The iron, the ferric oxide gives it that amber color. And those stone tiles are actually then laminated between two pieces of glass and put into a standard insulated glass unit. And that allows the building to glow from its interior light. There's no special lighting on the facade. It's actually the corridor lighting. And then during the day, obviously the inverse happens, where the light from the exterior kind of bleeds into the building. It has a really positive impact, particularly on the performance floor, because they can leave all the doors open and they can get natural daylight into the rehearsals, into the performance chamber while they're doing rehearsals or doing tech setup, or they're building scenography and so forth. So while it isn't transparent like the Wyly Theater, it does provide just natural daylight and breaks the hermetic seal that is conventional of performing arts facilities. So this is the cube. If I'm going to denude it, you see what the whole building is organized around. I'm now going to show it in plan. An L of reconfigurable theaters. Now, ostensibly, there are three, and I'm going to say why I say ostensibly. It's really a system, but there's a large, a medium, and a small. In their natural states, they can house about 450, 200, and 100. There's then a fourth tiny venue on the upper left that I don't have identified, and that's a small rehearsal space. But the reason I say this is a system and not really three, to be honest, we say three because that was the easiest way as we were designing it and building it to identify where things were to go. But it really is a system in which, through the use of, I'll go back and forth. You see I'm turning on 4 big, thick magenta lines. Those magenta lines are massive acoustic guillotine walls. They weigh 2 of them are 46 tons each, and 2 of them are 23 tons each. And they create an acoustic buffer in combination with those kind of interstitial spaces. And it allows this system not to be 3 theaters, but proportionally for those theaters to extend and to combine into 10 possible configurations. Okay, so now you have a building that isn't 3, it's actually 10 possible proportions. Sorry, and I'm going to go, again, just as I talked about in the Wyly, dare to be dumb, to use known technologies. We're moving the floors. Here, I'll show. Floor systems allow us to create reconfigurable environments within each of the spaces. This is using a technology that was really originally designed for the movement and control of shipping containers. There are a number of movable balcony elements that are all moved on air casters. Again, that's a really dumb technology. You just need compressed air. There is a series of demountable catwalk gridiron elements, and then a suite of chair systems and rake systems that allow us basically to build an infinite number of sort of chair organizations within this. And what that means is that within any individual proportion, there are multiple stage audience configurations, and the building, in fact, has, as of the day we opened, already had 62 possible stage audience configurations for which we already had gone through, I'll say the building department. The building is sited on Port Authority land, so it's not the building department, it's something called, actually, we won't get to that. But anyway, so it already has 62 possible stage audience configurations, and the institution is already inventing more. So again, I talked about how at the Wyly Theater, there were 4 presets and they invented others. We're opening with 62 in this building, and they're already starting to invent new ones. I said that when we were looking at the Wyly Theater, we started to realize there was the potential not only to control form of performance, but procession of performance. And so everything that you see in this yellow and blue hashed lines, any of that can be defined as either front of house or back of house in order to allow an artistic director to control sequence as well. And let me describe what I mean by that. Okay, so in this configuration, the public would be moving around the perimeter and there'd be 3 different coincident performances. In this configuration, it's a bicameral configuration where you might have people coming at 7 o'clock on one side to the larger venue and at 7:30 on the left-hand side to the smaller venue. In this configuration, the central zone has become sort of a secondary lobby. So let's say you're doing the Tribeca Film Festival here, and each one of the venues is actually having a screening. You can have a lobby that's in the center. This is actually a really exciting configuration that they've already used, which is they allow the public to encircle an auditorium, sort of like a Wagnerian configuration, and have everyone enter from every side, sort of dogpiling the stage. And then any combination and permutation of sequence and stage audience configuration within those 62. And so, if we called the Wyly a theater machine, we started to call this a mystery box or an instrument, something that could, constantly surprise the patrons, the public, every time they come to the building. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But just to give you some sense of that reconfigurability. Now, because of the mission to have a building that's responsive to the art and not the art responsive to the building, and this idea of having 62 configurations, it's much less mechanized. We had to make a very careful determination of what elements like the floor and the walls would be fully mechanized, what would be partially mechanized, like the balconies, and what would actually just require manual labor in order to install. And we had to cut the right balance between those. It would not be possible to fully mechanize 62 different configurations. Just to give you a sense of the spectrum of things that they've now performed in the space within the first season. the first was cats, the second was a vocal performance. This is an opera, dance, combination of really actually opera, theater, and dance. Okay, so that kind of flexibility, I've talked about how we resolve it in terms of its physicality, but there's an enormous issue that has to be resolved, which is how to resolve a high performance venue that's changing configurations acoustically. There is a history of these kinds of typologies, these kinds of buildings, being good for many things and great for nothing. I will say from the outset that both this and the building I'm about to show have gotten rave reviews in terms of their acoustics across all different kinds of performance typologies. And it comes from basically thinking of the building as a musical instrument. In this instance, and by the way, we worked with the same acoustician, Threshold Acoustics, and Carl Giegold out of Chicago on both of them, who I think they're exceptional. And they had Carl had a very beautiful metaphor for how we should approach the acoustics of the Perelman. He said, I need you to create a forest clearing. Why a forest clearing? It's a boundaryless space, and boundaryless doesn't mean the sound goes out and never comes back. It means that the sound goes out, and in a forest clearing, it means it'll eventually hit something. It'll hit leaves, it'll hit branches, it'll hit twigs, it'll hit the main shaft of the tree, and it'll always come back. So a forest clearing holds the energy, but you just don't know the acoustic signature of the space. And so that was the ideal environment within which we can then, through variable acoustics, create individual acoustic signatures for any kind of performance. Now, the problem is that to create that kind of randomness, humans, we don't do that well, and we certainly don't do it inexpensively. And so the innovation, again, was dumb. I said earlier, for us, dumb isn't a pejorative term. We created the world's most engineered crown molding. For those of you who are not Americans, we do a lot of balloon framing. It's very imprecise, and the way we hide that imprecision is either through what's called wainscoting, which is at the base of a wall, or crown molding, which is the top. And we basically, when the wall and the ceiling or the wall and the floor don't match up perfectly, they're not really square or whatever, we just hide it with this piece of wood. And so this is done the same way crown molding is made, which is it's just got a knife set, and you're just ripping 2x4s through a knife set. And we invented 3 distinct planks, and those planks can be organized in 1s, 2s, and 3s, and they always marry perfectly. I don't know if you can see my hands or not, but they always marry perfectly in whatever orientation they're in. And so that gave us almost, I think it's around 250 something combinations, combinations and permutations of just 3 very simple extrusions. And so there you can see them in situ. And this is the way that we made a forest clearing acoustically. And as I said, there's then within every 5-foot module around any surface of any performance chamber, we then have variable acoustics in order to allow the space to either be made more absorptive or more reflective. Now, there's a second huge problem acoustically, which is that the building, I often say that if it wasn't the absolute right place to do this building, it's the absolute wrong place to do this building. The building sits over all of the PATH trains that go out to New Jersey. It sits over the number 1 Cortlandt Street subway that goes north-south. It sits over a linear, you can see there's a truck down here and right there. It sits over basically there's a highway under the World Trade Center that services all of the loading docks below grade of all of the towers and the memorial and our building. And believe it or not, all of them enter at the base of our building. And then there's also a pedestrian corridor that goes from Tower 1 over to the Oculus. And all that was operational when we started construction. So we had to devise what we called super columns. These are columns that would thread down through the existing infrastructure and branch out sort of like a game of Twister to find bearing capacity. They came up and they were resolved in a plate. That's the big horizontal thing you see there. And the whole building then was tied together with a super truss. So the problem, obviously, is that you're building a performing arts center over something that has incredible vibration potential. But the advantage is that we've effectively made a huge bucket. And in the bottom of that bucket, we have 1 foot thick, high density rubber pads, basically base isolation pads, allow us to build the 3 auditoria like boxes in a box. That's the technical term. We like to call them ships in a bottle. And as long as you have any of those 2 massive acoustic guillotine walls, not only do these performance spaces not hear the vibration of the rumbling that's happening beneath it, but they literally can't hear anything that's going on in the adjacent chamber. So you can have a rock concert in one space and be doing poetry, spoken word in the other space. And this led people to ask, when the building was going up, they said, well, why are you building these little buildings on the interior of the big building? You can see there's those steel structures, smaller steel structures in the center. And the answer is because we were building little buildings on the interior of the bigger building. That's literally what we were doing. And now this allows me to go full circle back to what I said in the beginning about creating a pure, elegant shape in reaction to its context that we started to call the mystery box. I think most architects think of creating complex buildings that they say reveal themselves to the user over time. We actually wanted to create the inverse. We wanted to create a building that seems incredibly simple, and that every single time you come, you have a radically different experience. And the more you use it, the more you don't possibly understand how all those experiences are happening within this one relatively small structure. That idea of the mystery box actually is a tool, and I'll talk about 3 of them, that historically that architects have used to create suspension of disbelief. And it's not only through theaters, it's also through religious architecture. If you think about the things I'm about to say, you will also see in churches and mosques and synagogues. So the first was this idea that you go up, you process up into the building, right? This kind of elevation. I should say that people ask why we did this. As I already said, all of the trucks enter the back of our building. So that first 21 feet, that first 7 meters, that's literally not our building. We designed it, but that's all infrastructure of the Port Authority. And so we necessarily had to process people up into the building to get to the lobby level. But that idea that you raise up into the building, that's one device for creation of suspension of disbelief. Another is disorientation, right? So we had to make sure that even though people didn't know where north, south, east, west was, they didn't know, they couldn't see the context anymore. We, however, still had to make sure that they could navigate easily, and that's why there's super graphics throughout the building. It was just to support that sort of incredibly intuitive navigation because there was no other means to navigate. And the last is compression. When you're in the perimeter and you see these massive stone walls, they're over 70 feet tall, and you go from that space down into an 8-foot tall sound and light lock. These are the enclosures that you create such that light and sound can't enter into a performance chamber. That use of compression, as you think of sequences, like example in Gothic churches, was another way of creating suspension of disbelief, right? As you go through incredible compression and then you go into the chamber, that makes you feel that you're moving into another world. And so with that, I'm going to now transition from the Perelman to the last, which is, just check the time. Yeah, which is the Lindemann at Brown. And again, I'm going to give you the context of the project first. Starting in the mid-teens, 2015, 2016, Brown created something called the Brown Arts Institute. And the idea is that they wanted to embed within the arts all the other disciplines on campus, and they wanted the arts to become embedded within all the other disciplines on campus. And so they wanted to create a building that would basically be a laboratory for hybridization and interdisciplinary arts work. And they cited it on something called the Walk, which was the connector between the old Brown campus and the old Pembroke campus that got combined. And so basically creating a new artistic heart to the entire campus because this was land that they have available. So they've actually built 2 new facilities. One was done by Diller Scofidio about a decade ago. That's the Granoff. And that was more of a true lab, arts lab. And then ours is the performance facility that is directly across the walk. So to give some background, Brown, for being an exceptional university and having exceptional arts, really didn't have exceptional venues. And they saw the need for creating a dance space, a small ensemble space that was sort of like a cave space with ambisonic sound, like what you're seeing on the left. But they also had this very real need to have a high performance symphony orchestra space. And the things, what you're seeing on the left, that it's well known how you can create a space. In fact, so the Wyly Theater is effectively that, right? It's kind of like a highly reconfigurable space that can do many different kinds of arts typologies. But the outlier that seemed to make this feel impossible was how can you actually combine it with a symphony orchestra? It basically had never been done. And the reason for that is that because of the audience size, symphonies usually have 18 to 2,400 people. They also have an enormous amount of acoustic energy. There's simply no way to take that kind of space and volume and close it down so it would have intimacy and excellent acoustics and sight lines for an intimate theater or a small ensemble space, a recital hall. So it seemed that these things were unreconcilable until we collectively discussed the reality that Brown isn't a very large institution and Providence isn't a very large city, and that we could actually have performances, symphony orchestra performances with only 600 people. And if you think about that, that's odd because we needed a venue that could have an orchestra of 105 and a chorus of 80 performing to basically only 3 times that amount, which is a very unusual situation. But because of that, it allowed us to invent a new typology that doesn't exist. And that is a single space that can convert. It's the most mechanized of the 3 that I'm showing between an experimental media configuration, recital configuration, end stage theater and dance configuration, full orchestra configuration, and then a flat floor, sort of like the Armory. And I'm going to show how it converts. And I'll say that the building has this kind of unusual verticality to it. And that's because we needed to still have the volume in the symphony orchestra space to allow for the acoustic energy of the symphony. Now, I want you to watch every one of the surfaces, floors, walls, and ceiling transform. And the long back, the side walls, these here, you'll see them here, are actually separated in 2, and they can transform independently of each other. So I'm going to go from the inert configuration, and you'll see that the back walls and the side walls come in, and the ceiling comes down, and this creates that kind of multimedia cave space. Now, the next one is all of the side walls come in. The floor changes its rake, and the ceiling comes down to create a configuration for, I'm getting tired, for a recital configuration. And then going into an end stage theater and dance, side walls go out on the stage side to create side wings. Acoustically, you don't really need the ceiling except for one small element. The seating creates a more steep rake. And then finally, everything moves out to create the symphony orchestra configuration. Again, the ceiling, although it seems like it's not taking much of a shape, that shape is actually incredibly important to the high performance of the auditorium. And then lastly, is it goes back to that kind of inert space in which you can basically do anything, big flat floor, Armory space where you can do banquets and you can do large format art. So this is the hall itself. And if we called the first one the theater machine, the second one the mystery box, this one we really have always called an instrument, that it is tuned really like a musical instrument. And so here you see the media, recital, theater and dance, full symphony orchestra. This is actually Itzhak Perelman performing on the opening night. And I'll come back to that because it was a very important story that happened when he performed. Carrie Mae Weems, this is big installation art, and then the opening banquet. And so you see the kind of flexibility. As I said, this one is the most reconfigurable. It's the most push of a button. It is, frankly, the most reconfigurable theater in the world. It still, however, requires stagehands, so it is not fully automated, and that's important. But it has basically lasers throughout the entire thing. So as things begin to move, if someone were to put their hand between something, the whole building stops. If you were to pull out any kind of safety element, again, the building stops. So it's a super intelligent instrument. Now I'm going to show its reconfigurability. This one's a little longer. I should say, each one of these time-lapse photos, we always do them while the building is just finished construction, and we're still trying to figure out how to do it. So they always show lots of people running around. This can now be done, in a limited number of hours with a really limited number of stagehands. But here you see the sidewalls coming in. It's creating the theater mode. That's deployable acoustics, so they can control the absorptive or reflectivity of the space. And this is the most important thing. You should see the acoustic reflectors, how we can literally change the volume of the space, and they can take really any configuration. I'll come back to that in a moment. Here it's going into the recital configuration. Now it's moving back out, I think, into the... No, it's going into the media configuration. All right. So the way we achieve this, the building, I'm going to keep coming back to the word dumb. The building's dumb. I don't mean it's easy to do, but it's dumb. It's a big bridge. Okay, so there's two piers, just like a bridge, and then steel spanning between it, and you can see that the white elements, these are the gantries. They're just hung from the bridge structure, and so that's how these gantries. Excuse me. We will stop the back blaze. You can see how. The gantries just move, and we're using, when I say gantry, it's literally a gantry just like moving shipping containers. These are the ARPs. They are the thing that most changes the acoustic signature, along with the deployable absorption or reflectivity that's on the sidewalls. Again, super dumb. We just used the technology that, if you are watching the US Open or you're watching the Super Bowl, the cameras are zooming around the space, right? And they're doing it using guy wires. And why do you know they're safe? Because you can imagine what would happen if a camera broke off and injured a whole slew of people as it was racing around watching Tom Brady throw the football. And so we know that they're fail-safe. So we just basically used the same system to control these 48 acoustic reflector panels, and they can take any geometry you want, each one individually, as you see here. But of course, we're trying to make orchestrated configurations of them, and we can do anything. So you can see in this case, just for fun, we dropped them all down 8 feet off the floor just to make a building that was an 8-foot sandwich. So you see how that not only can we control the acoustics, but we can also control the spatial experience again. So the building becomes a totally tunable environment. These are elements that we basically cribbed from the backs of fire trucks. Fire trucks, they work. If they don't work, people get injured in fires. This is how we were basically allowing the balconies to move and to keep the egress basically always combined with the rest of the building. And so we needed to have these deployable extensor arms to allow that to happen. And then there's just, this whole host of other kinds of mechanized elements and a continuous grid system such that the building, students can actually get up and work on lighting, work on sonography and so forth without having to go through OSHA, because there's a continuous plate at the top of the building so that, no one can fall, right? There's no hazard. Okay, so I said I was going to come back to the opening night in this really important moment. Itzhak Perelman performed a piece that has with his full symphony that has a really, really amazing, beautiful credenza. And he is the virtuoso you think he is. The credenza was extraordinary. But he said that before the performance, when they were rehearsing, he said, look, historically, I never know what to do with this piece because the space either is great for the symphony and then I'm too quiet when I do the credenza, or the space is great for me, but then the orchestra just blows the space out. It's too loud. And so during the performance, right before the credenza, we literally just took the ceiling and adjusted it real time because it has no sound whatsoever. And so the building literally was an instrument that changed its tuning on the spot. Right? It can take about 5 seconds for these things to deploy. And it went from being a space that had the energy of the full symphony to when it did his credenza, suddenly you could hear his fingers moving up and down on the fret. And afterwards he said, look, I've never had this experience where I felt like the building heard me, like the building was responding to me and doing what I wanted it to do. And I guess that's the potential of these kinds of building instruments. And so I'm just going to end quickly with, there's another aspect to this building, which is that we took this idea, if we wanted the art to infect the rest of campus and we wanted the rest of the campus to invade the art, yes, the programming does that, but the programming is out of our hands as architects. So we create the tool such that that kind of interdisciplinary programming can happen. But we also asked, is there a way that we could do it literally? And so the building has this transparent slice that runs straight through the entire ground floor, the entire performance level. When I say straight through, I mean literally. Even the sound and light locks, we put mirror in it so that you still have this sense of continuity. And it's even, the entire ground level of the main space is transparent. And that allows literally students to walk by and watch the creation of art, similar to how I talked about it happening at the Wyly Theater in Dallas. Now there is and of course, when artists, just like in Wyly, when the artists don't want to be seen, there's the ability to black out and control view in. And so here you can see there's a curtain, and we took the curtain and we designed it so it matched the extruded aluminum facade. So it looks like the facade just kind of goes straight through the building. But there's a misconception that the glass is a terrible acoustic material. At first, that it's a great acoustic material in terms of dampening sound because it's got different thicknesses and different densities and they're interlayers and so forth. So it cuts out a lot of sound. But what's interesting is actually within the first 8 feet of a performance space, you want a lot of reflectivity, right? You want the high frequency sound to be bumped back out into the space. And glass is great for that. And so having an 8-foot tall glass zone actually improved the acoustic performance of the space. It didn't come at the expense of the space. And so let me describe what the 3 different lines of glass are doing. The outboard layer, actually, I'll just go to this. So the outboard layer, it's a standard insulated glass unit. That's actually great for cutting out a huge amount of sound. I'll go back. You see then there's an air cavity, a walkway that runs around then the laminate of glass, thick laminate of glass that defines the chamber's acoustic geometry. I go back, that's the middle layer. You see it's 2 12-millimeter lights that are laminated together. And then we shaped the ground level at first 8 feet, which really thick arcs of acoustic glass, and that was to pump that high frequency back into the space. And so the end result is this, right? That you have this incredibly transparent ground level that allows literally the art to bleed out and the public to bleed in, and all the other investigations to kind of come into the building. All right, and I'm just going to quickly end with just showing as an aside, we just kind of went bonkers with a motif, and that was, looking at Lincoln Center, very similar architectural palette that each of the architects worked with, but they each carried their own motif. And so we took this idea of, we were doing a contemporary building, we were doing it in Providence. Obviously, we weren't going to do a building that was looked like the buildings around it, but we wanted it to play nicely. And one of our observations is that these older historic buildings, they had a lot of relief in them. And so we created a lot of relief, and it's a bit of a pun, but how columns, the Greeks used fluting as a way to hide that they were making vertical things out of horizontal pieces of marble. And so we did the same thing here. We had these extruded aluminum elements, and we hid their horizontality by having the fluting. And the fluting has 7-foot wide flutes, and then it's subdivided into smaller flutes, and then flutes within the flutes. And then we just carried that motif throughout the building, very much learning from Lincoln Center. So you can see the benches there. These are other benches carrying that motif. Benches on the interior. This is a light art installation in the lobby that was done by Leo Villarreal. And then you see its impact on the overall building. Okay, I think I've probably gone longer. Yeah, I have gone longer than we were scripted for. So I will stop and, you know what, actually, this is, I wanted to end with this, which is just a reminder of where I was going with all of this, which is going back to that comment I made about Noguchi and his playscapes, right? What you see on the right, that's what modernism told us flexibility is. And just as a reminder, I think we're at a moment in time where, as architects, we need to be inventing new forms of flexibility. And I think they have a lot to do with specificity and providing a kind of pre-existing palette with which or against which you then create and operate. So that's, yeah, now I'm done.
Thank you so much, Joshua. I don't think anyone will mind that you went on a little longer, because that was an absolutely incredible presentation. I think we don't have much time for questions, but I just want to say that the moment where you talked about the building as an instrument and the fact that you were able to change the ceiling configuration mid-performance is maybe one of the most amazing things I've ever heard on one of our live talks. Really, really extraordinary concept, and taking flexibility to another level entirely.
Thank you.
So many questions. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to get to them all, but I'll ask the top question, which is a really great one from Taylor. Taylor asks, how might you maximize flexibility for a company with extremely limited financial and staff resources, for example, a community theatre? I think it's a great question. You sort of talked about some of these mechanisms being more manual and some being slightly more advanced. So any suggestions for kind of a good low budget option?
So, I didn't show it, but we worked on the performance space for a high school. And that is exactly what we were confronted with. And the important thing is to go tried and true, right? And so I'll just describe what we did in that. We don't have it on our website yet, but I think we will soon. We essentially we started with a shoebox. Why a shoebox? Because, shoeboxes, you're guaranteed to have exceptional acoustics in a shoebox shape. So we started with a shoebox. And then we created a wall that was just, and again, it's a dumb gantry, just like you were seeing, we were using in Brown, also frankly in the Wyly Theater, and that's a piece of technology you're going to find in any warehouse, right? Just to pick up large objects and move it. And that allowed us just to translate the wall to change the dimension of the space. And then within that wall, we put retractable bleacher seats like in any gymnasium in a high school. And so it meant that they could have a big flat floor space, they could have a small flat floor space, they could have a big flat floor space with a rake, and they could have a small flat floor space with a rake. And so it's just with these really dumb, really simple elements, we are already able to create a space that had 4 different configurations. And then there are other things like that. But I guess I just want to emphasize that, look, I don't think this needs to be, it's not technology dependent. When I say technology, I mean expensive technology dependent. You can use really, really, really simple things. The invention is figuring out how to use a really simple known thing in a new way. In that particular thing, this thing I was just describing, we had the control booth within that moving element also. And therefore, we also had to be concerned about egress in the two different configurations. But again, that can be easily solved. That's just architecture.
Fantastic. It makes so much sense. Yeah, unfortunately, we're really close to time now. I just wanted to pass on another congratulations for your A+ Awards accolades, particularly for the Perelman Performing Arts Center. I think today's presentation shows exactly why the jurors were taken by the project. Do you have any words about what winning an award like that means to a firm like yours, or what, sort of how it's beneficial to architects in general?
I mean, it's beneficial in lots of ways. I mean, these are awards that are conferred by, in a way, it's our peers, right? This isn't, there are awards that come from outside of the architectural community, and this is within the architectural community. And that means it's a sophisticated community. And so those often mean more to us. So that's what I think of all the kinds of awards, those are the ones that I think that we enjoy the most. I will just say, look, and the reality is that unfortunately in this day and age of commerciality and so forth, that, having projects that have been recognized, particularly by peer groups, just help clients trust you. I wish it wasn't that way, because I feel that I think there are a lot of students on the live feed. We're getting more and more into a situation where you're not allowed to do it unless you've done it before. And I think that will be a pity if that continues in that arc, because I think that will curtail an enormous amount of creativity and intelligence. So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think hopefully a talk like today is some kind of antidote to that, in terms of sort of passing it forward. The knowledge that you managed to pack into this 45 minutes was extraordinary, especially with the diagrams and the animations. Absolutely fantastic. You made something very complex seem simple and very easy to understand. So I really appreciate your time today, Joshua. And thank you everyone for joining us. Before you go, if you can answer the poll, we'd love to have your firm participating in A+ in the coming season. And who knows, maybe you'll be on the stage next year at Future Fest. Thank you again, Joshua. We'll have to do this again sometime. Join us again for our next talk, which is actually in just 1 hour from now. We'll be talking with 5 members of HDR's team doing a panel talk. So that should be a really fun and engaging session. Hope to see you there soon. Thanks again, Joshua, and
thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.